East India Company, also known as the Honourable East India Company and informally as John Company, was an English and later British joint stock company, formed to pursue trade with the East Indies, but which ended up trading mainly with the Indian subcontinent and King China. Originally chartered as the Governor and Company of Merchants of London trading into the East Indies, the company rose to account for half of the world's trade, particularly trade in basic commodities that included cotton, silk, indigo dye, salt, saltpeter, tea and opium. The company also ruled the beginnings of the British Empire in India. The company received a royal charter from Queen Elizabeth on 31 December 1600, making it the oldest among several similarly formed European East India companies. Wealthy merchants and aristocrats owned the company's shares. The government owned no shares and had only indirect control. The company eventually came to rule large areas of India with its own private armies, exercising military power and assuming administrative functions. Company rule in India effectively began in 1757 after the Battle of Plassey and lasted until 1858 when, following the Indian Rebellion of 1857, the Government of India Act 1858 led to the British Crown assuming direct control of India in the form of the new British Raj. Despite frequent government intervention, the company had recurring problems with its finances. The company was dissolved in 1874 as a result of the East India Stock Dividend Redemption Act passed 1 year earlier, as the Government of India Act had by then rendered it vestigial, powerless, and obsolete. The official government machinery of British India had assumed its governmental functions and absorbed its armies. Founding. Soon after the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588, London merchants presented a petition to Queen Elizabeth I for permission to sail to the Indian Ocean. The permission was granted, and despite the defeat of the English Armada in 1589, on 10 April 1591 3 ships sailed from Torbay around the Cape of Good Hope to the Arabian Sea on one of the earliest English overseas Indian expeditions. One of them, the Edward Bonaventure, then sailed around Cape Comorin and onto the Malay Peninsula and subsequently returned to England in 1594. In 1596, 3 more ships sailed east, however, these were all lost at sea. 3 years later, on the 22nd of September 1599, another group of merchants met and stated their intention to venture in the pretended voyage to the East Indies, and the sums that they will adventure, committing £30,133. 2 days later, on the 24th of September, the adventurers reconvened and resolved to apply to the Queen for support of the project. Although their first attempt had not been completely successful, they nonetheless sought the Queen's unofficial approval to continue, bought ships for their venture and increased their capital to £68,373. The adventurers convened again a year later. This time they succeeded, and on the 31st of December 1600, the Queen granted a royal charter to George, Earl of Cumberland, and 215 knights, aldermen, and burgesses, under the name of Governor and Company of Merchants of London trading with the East Indies. For a period of 15 years the charter awarded the newly formed company a monopoly on trade with all countries east of the Cape of Good Hope and west of the Straits of Magellan. Sir James Lancaster commanded the first East India Company voyage in 1601 and returned in 1603, and in March 1604 Sir Henry Middleton commanded the second voyage. General William Keeling, a captain during the second voyage, led the third voyage from 1607 to 1610. Initially, the company struggled in the spice trade because of the competition from the already well-established Dutch East India Company. The company opened a factory in Bantam on the first voyage, and imports of pepper from Java were an important part of the company's trade for 20 years. The factory in Bantam was closed in 1683. During this time ships belonging to the company arriving in India docked at Surat, which was established as a trade transit point in 1608. In the next 2 years, the company built its first factory in South India in the town of Machilapatnam on the Coromandel coast of the Bay of Bengal. The high profits reported by the company after landing in India initially prompted King James I to grant subsidiary licenses to other trading companies in England. But in 1609 he renewed the charter given to the company for an indefinite period, including a clause which specified that the charter would cease to be in force if the trade turned unprofitable for 3 consecutive years. The company was led by 1 governor and 24 directors, who made up the Court of Directors. They, in turn, reported to the Court of Proprietors, which appointed them. 10 committees reported to the Court of Directors. Foothold in India. English traders frequently engaged in hostilities with their Dutch and Portuguese counterparts in the Indian Ocean. The company achieved a major victory over the Portuguese in the Battle of Swally in 1612. The company decided to explore the feasibility of gaining a territorial foothold in mainland India, with official sanction of both countries, and requested that the Crown launch a diplomatic mission. In 1612, James I instructed Sir Thomas Roe to visit the Mughal Emperor Nur-ud-Din Salim Jahangir to arrange for a commercial treaty that would give the company exclusive rights to reside and build factories in Surat and other areas. In return, the company offered to provide the emperor with goods and rarities from the European market. This mission was highly successful, as Jahangir sent a letter to James through Sir Thomas Roe, upon which assurance of your royal love I have given my general command to all the kingdoms and ports of my dominions to receive all the merchants of the English nation as the subjects of my friend, that in what place soever they choose to live, they may have free liberty without any restraint, and at what port soever they shall arrive, that neither Portugal nor any other shall dare to molest their quiet, and in what city soever they shall have residence. I have commanded all my governors and captains to give them freedom answerable to their own desires, to sell, buy, and to transport into their country at their pleasure. For confirmation of our love and friendship, I desire your majesty to command your merchants to bring in their ships of all sorts of rarities and rich goods fit for my palace, and that you be pleased to send me your royal letters by every opportunity, that I may rejoice in your health and prosperous affairs, that our friendship may be interchanged and eternal. Nur-ud-Din Salim Jahangir. Letter to James I. Expansion. The company, which benefited from the imperial patronage, soon expanded its commercial trading operations, eclipsing the Portuguese Estado da India, which had established bases in Goa, Chittagong and Bombay. The East India Company also launched a joint effort attack with the Dutch United East India Company on Portuguese and Spanish ships off the coast of China, which helped secure their ports in China. The company created trading posts in Surat, Madras, Bombay, and Calcutta. By 1647, the company had 23 factories, each under the command of a factor or master merchant and governor if so chosen, and had 90 employees in India. The major factories became the walled forts of Fort William in Bengal, Fort St. George in Madras, and the Bombay Castle. In 1634, the Mughal emperor extended his hospitality to the English traders to the region of Bengal, and in 1717 completely waived customs duties for the trade. The company's mainstay businesses were by then in cotton, silk, indigo dye, saltpeter and tea. The Dutch were aggressive competitors, and had meanwhile expanded their monopoly of the spice trade in the Malaccan Straits by ousting the Portuguese in 1640–41. With reduced Portuguese and Spanish influence in the region, the EEIC and Dutch East India Company entered a period of intense competition, resulting in the Anglo-Dutch Wars of the 17th and 18th centuries. Meanwhile, in 1657, Oliver Cromwell renewed the Charter of 1609, and brought about minor changes in the holding of the company. The status of the company was further enhanced by the restoration of monarchy in England. In an act aimed at strengthening the power of the EIC, King Charles II provisioned the EIC with the rights to autonomous territorial acquisitions, to mint money, to command fortresses and troops and form alliances, to make war and peace, and to exercise both civil and criminal jurisdiction over the acquired areas. William Hedges was sent in 1682 to Shaistar Khan, the Mughal governor of Bengal, in order to obtain a firman, an imperial directive that would grant England regular trading privileges throughout the Mughal Empire. However, the company's governor in London, Sir Josiah Child, interfered with Hedges's mission, causing Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb to break off the negotiations. In 1689 a Mughal fleet commanded by Sidi Yaqub attacked Bombay. After a year of resistance the EIC surrendered in 1690, and the company sent envoys to Aurangzeb's camp to plead for a pardon. The company's envoys had to prostrate themselves before the emperor, pay a large indemnity, and promise better behavior in the future. The emperor withdrew his troops and the company subsequently re-established itself in Bombay and set up a new base in Calcutta, Japan in 1613. During the rule of Tokugawa Hidetada of the Tokugawa shogunate, the British ship Clove, under the command of Captain John Saris, was the country's first to arrive in Japan. Saris was the chief factor of the EIC's trading post in Java, and with the assistance of William Adams, a British sailor who had arrived in Japan in 1600, was able to gain permission from the ruler to establish a commercial house in Hirado on the Japanese island of Kyushu. We give free license to the subjects of the King of Great Britain, Sir Thomas Smythe, Governor and Company of the East Indian merchants and adventurers, forever safely come into any of our ports of our Empire of Japan with their ships and merchandise, without any hindrance to them or their goods, and to abide, buy, sell, and barter according to their own manner with all nations, to tarry here as long as they think good, and to depart at their pleasure. However, unable to obtain Japanese raw silk for import to China, and with their trading area reduced to Hirado and Nagasaki from 1616 onwards, the company closed down their commercial house in 1623. Mughal convoy piracy incident of 1695. In September 1695, Captain Henry Every, an English pirate on board the Fancy, reached the Straits of Bab el-Mandeb, where he teamed up with 5 other pirate captains to make an attack on the Indian fleet making the annual voyage to Mocha. The Mughal convoy included the treasure-laden Ganjai Sawai, reported to be the greatest in the Mughal fleet and the largest ship operational in the Indian Ocean, and its escort, the Fatima Hamid. They were spotted passing the straits en route to Surat. The pirates gave chase and caught up with the Fatima Hamid some days later, and meeting little resistance, took some £50,000 to £60,000 worth of treasure. Every continued in pursuit and managed to overhaul the Ganjai Sawai, who put up a fearsome fight, but it too was eventually taken. The ship carried enormous wealth and, according to contemporary East India Company sources, was carrying a relative of the Grand Mughal, though there is no evidence to suggest that it was his daughter and her retinue. The loot from the Ganjai Sawai totaled between £325,000 and £600,000, including 500,000 gold and silver pieces, and has become known as the richest ship ever taken by pirates. In a letter sent to the Privy Council by Sir John Gaya, then Governor of Bombay and head of the East India Company, Gaya claims that, "It is certain the pirates did do very barbarously by the people of the Ganjai Sawai and Abdul Gaffar's ship, to make them confess where their money was." The pirates set free the survivors who were left aboard their emptied ships, to continue their voyage back to India. When the news arrived in England it caused an outcry. In response, a combined bounty of £1,000 was offered for Every's capture by the Privy Council and East India Company, leading to the first worldwide manhunt in recorded history. The plunder of Aurangzeb's treasure ship had serious consequences for the English East India Company. The furious Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb ordered Sidi Yaqub and Nawab Daud Khan to attack and close 4 of the company's factories in India and imprison their officers, who were almost lynched by a mob of angry Mughals, blaming them for their countrymen's depredations, and threatened to put an end to all English trading in India. To appease Emperor Aurangzeb and particularly his Grand Vizier Asad Khan, Parliament exempted every from all of the acts of grace and amnesties it would subsequently issue to other pirates. An 18th-century depiction of Henry Every, with the Fancy shown engaging its prey in the background. British pirates that fought during the Child's War engaging the Ganges. Depiction of Captain Every's encounter with the Mughal Emperor's granddaughter after his September 1695 capture of the Mughal trader Ganges, forming a complete monopoly. Trade monopoly. The prosperity that the officers of the company enjoyed allowed them to return to Britain and establish sprawling estates and businesses, and to obtain political power. The company developed a lobby in the English Parliament, under pressure from ambitious tradesmen and former associates of the company, who wanted to establish private trading firms in India. A deregulating act was passed in 1694. This allowed any English firm to trade with India, unless specifically prohibited by Act of Parliament, thereby annulling the charter that had been in force for almost 100 years. By an act that was passed in 1698, a new, parallel, East India Company was floated under a state-backed indemnity of £2 million. The powerful stockholders of the old company quickly subscribed a sum of £315,000 in the new concern, and dominated the new body. The two companies wrestled with each other for some time, both in England and in India, for a dominant share of the trade. It quickly became evident that, in practice, the original company faced scarcely any measurable competition. The companies merged in 1708, by a tripartite indenture involving both companies and the state. Under this arrangement, the merged company lent to the Treasury a sum of £3,200,000, in return for exclusive privileges for the next 3 years, after which the situation was to be reviewed. The amalgamated company became the United Company of Merchants of England trading to the East Indies. In the following decades there was a constant battle between the company lobby and the Parliament. The company sought a permanent establishment, while the Parliament would not willingly allow it greater autonomy and so relinquish the opportunity to exploit the company's profits. In 1712, another act renewed the status of the company, though the debts were repaid. By 1720, 15% of British imports were from India, almost all passing through the company, which reasserted the influence of the company lobby. The license was prolonged until 1766 by yet another act in 1730. At this time, Britain and France became bitter rivals. Frequent skirmishes between them took place for control of colonial possessions. In 1742, fearing the monetary consequences of a war, the British government agreed to extend the deadline for the licensed exclusive trade by the company in India until 1783, in return for a further loan of £1 million. Between 1756 and 1763, the 7 Years' War diverted the state's attention towards consolidation and defense of its territorial possessions in Europe and its colonies in North America. The war took place on Indian soil, between the company troops and the French forces. In 1757, the law officers of the Crown delivered the Pratt-York opinion distinguishing overseas territories acquired by right of conquest from those acquired by private treaty. The opinion asserted that, while the Crown of Great Britain enjoyed sovereignty over both, only the property of the former was vested in the Crown. With the advent of the Industrial Revolution, Britain surged ahead of its European rivals. Demand for Indian commodities was boosted by the need to sustain the troops and the economy during the war, and by the increased availability of raw materials and efficient methods of production. As home to the Revolution, Britain experienced higher standards of living. Its spiraling cycle of prosperity, demand and production had a profound influence on overseas trade. The company became the single largest player in the British global market. William Henry Pine notes in his book The Microcosm of London that, on the 1st of March 1801, the debts of the East India Company to £5,393,989, their effects to £15,404,736, and their sales increased since February 1793. From £4,988,300 to £7,602,041. Saltpetre trade. Sir John Banks, a businessman from Kent who negotiated an agreement between the king and the company, began his career in a syndicate arranging contracts for victualling the navy, an interest he kept up for most of his life. He knew that Samuel Pepys and John Evelyn had amassed a substantial fortune from the Levant and Indian trades. He became a director and later, as governor of the East India Company in 1672. He arranged a contract which included a loan of £20,000 and £30,000 worth of saltpetre, also known as potassium nitrate, a primary ingredient in gunpowder, for the king, at the price it shall sell by the candle, that is by auction, where bidding could continue as long as an inch-long candle remained alight. Outstanding debts were also agreed and the company permitted to export 250 tons of saltpetre. Again in 1673, Banks successfully negotiated another contract for 700 tons of saltpetre at £37,000 between the king and the company. So urgent was the need to supply the armed forces in the United Kingdom, America and elsewhere that the authorities sometimes turned a blind eye on the untaxed sales. One governor of the company was even reported as saying in 1864 that he would rather have the saltpetre made than the tax on salt.